You can get set up or not, I'll just tell you.
Yes, it's being live streamed.
Live stream. Go ahead, Aparna. It's all yours.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. A warm welcome to this evening's Colors of Glory virtual meet. I am Aparna Chandrasekharan, one of the coordinators of this event. This is one in a series of virtual meets we have been hosting ever since the pandemic set in last year. While the regular attendees of our events do not need to be told what our organization is about, kindly bear with me through a brief introduction for the sake of the new attendees whom we are delighted to welcome. Traditionally, our country never lacked organizations celebrating our heritage in almost every sphere of human activity, be it art, literature, or politics. However, for whatever reasons, the Indian Armed Forces do not really enjoy this privilege. It is this grave anomaly that our founders set out to rectify by raising Colors of Glory Foundation, the first of its kind in India 6 years ago. Today, we are proud to assert that we have carved a niche for ourselves, celebrating the heroism of our men and women in arms, past and present, through innumerable events, outdoor and indoor, varying from battle reenactments and commemorative marathons to documentary shows and intercollegiate military history quizzes. Our website features over 130 popular blogs. We have a pan-Indian membership base of both armed forces veterans and civilian gentry, and some overseas members as well. With the pandemic waning, we are happy to announce that we are resuming our in-person events from June this year and are confident of scaling loftier heights as we go on. We will indeed continue to host the virtual meets, although less frequently, to reach out to our national and international audience. Meanwhile, we invite all of you who are not yet members of our organization to join us in our unique mission. Please visit our website to know how to join. I am delighted to give you all a glimpse of the road we have traveled so far through this brief presentation. I now hand over the baton to Captain Ramachandran. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Aparna. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to introduce our very special speaker today, whom I've been hoping to bring to our forum for quite some time, ever since I read his book and reviewed it for Madras Museums in 2018. But, COVID and also, I mean, ultimately, I didn't even have his email ID. I got in touch with Mr. Nadin Chavian, his associate in Chennai, before I could get in touch with him. Now coming to the formal introduction, before the introduction, let me tell you that this book, when it came to me for review, Mr. Mutaya, he was like a commander in literary matters, as I was telling before here, we're all our lieutenants. He used to hand over anything military to me. He said, review this. So I thought another thing has come. Once he told me offhand, there's some squadrons in Royal Air Force with which were sort of raised on donation from southern India. So it was quite a job researching and finding out. Ultimately, I did find out. So like that, This came to me, I thought, it's another, but once I started reading the book, this is one story, so fascinating. How the state settlements came into existence and the book he has written. So anyway, he'll be speaking about, I don't want to go much more into it. I'll make this formal introduction. A Singaporean by birth, Mr. Nedumaran Namashivai was educated in Singapore's Raffles Institution and the University of Bristol, UK. He holds a degree in law from Britain and is an accomplished military historian gifted with a literary flair, besides being a talented sketch artist. Engaged as the curator of the famous Battle Box War Museum in Singapore for 8 years from the year 2000. He has featured in numerous interviews in war-related programs on TV, radio, and other media, with a particular focus on his specialty, the Second World War in Southeast Asia. He left the museum field in 2008 to make his foray into the publishing industry, continuing his passion for military history, paying special attention to the much overlooked military heritage of the sepoys of the Indian subcontinent who served in Southeast Asia since the 80s century. By conducting numerous public presentations on the sepoy legacy in both Singapore and Malaysia, Nedumaran became the first, until the date, the only person to devote his time to raise public awareness of the sepoys in the region. In an effort to expand the sepoys' exposure to the public's consciousness, he has also served as an expert consultant and scriptwriter for various sepoy-related film and theatre productions. His monumental book, The Forgotten Sentinels, which he will be speaking about today, is an exhaustive narratively untold saga of the sepoys who created settlements along the Malacca Straits and other key posts in the East Indies during 18th and to early 20th centuries, opening up Southeast Asia to the world at large the first time. In fact, the maiden expedition to the Philippines by the Madras Sepoys in 1762, that was a curtain raiser for the incredible story that was to follow during the next 2 centuries, finds only a passing mention in my own book on the history of the South Indian soldiery. That was how preoccupied we were with the tumultuous events unfolding in the subcontinent, from Plaza to Seringapatam and beyond, in the same era. But for Mr. Nedumaran's dedicated and furious efforts, this epic story of the sepoys would have largely remained forgotten. No wonder he calls them the Forgotten Sentinels. You'd be rest assured that his next work, which is in the offing, Minus of the Rich, the Battle of Kampar 1941-42, would be an equally enthralling account of the annals of the Second World War. Now, without further ado, I invite Mr. Nedumaran to take the screen. All yours, Nedu.
First of all, I would like to say that it's an honor and privilege to be invited here by the Colors of Glory Foundation and, of course, Captain D.P. Ramachandran. And for all of you in India who have taken the time to spend an evening on Saturday and elsewhere, I know in Malaysia and Singapore is late at night, and I suspect in 1 or 2 other countries, I hope this will be quite worthwhile and you'll come away with something with subject matter and make you ponder about this legacy that we're going to talk about. The presentation is about, I was invited to talk a bit about my book, but I think I'll try to approach it in a different manner. I have a little slideshow. I'll invite you on a visual journey, and I want to make the stars of the show the sepoys themselves. That is the main subject matter. The book is ancillary, because I was obsessed about the sepoys. So the book is just something that came by itself, and I would, with Captain Ramachandran's permission, I would like to start the slideshow. Could I? Hello? It's gone silent here.
No, I'm made your co-host. You can share the screen and go ahead.
Okay, so I'm going to share the screen now.
Yeah.
And yes, I will get to this whole thing now. Yes, so this is the working title of the book, The Sepoys of Malaya, Singapore and Southeast Asia, the founding years, 18th to early 20th centuries. I'd like to approach this in 3 segments. First one will be a quick run through of the Sepoy project and me, a personal journey. It may sound self-indulgent, but I think I'll also say that for the last 20 years, I'm probably it's a lonely journey. I'm the only one who seems to be the one who cares so much about this project. So you will understand the state of affairs of this subject in Malaysia and Singapore today. And you'll also get to know how the book the idea gelled in my head. I'll spend no more than 5 minutes on this. And then we come to the real meat, the subject matter, the slideshow proper, which I think you'll all find interesting. Because in fact, I enjoy showing it myself. When I'm bored, I watch it myself. So that's the way it is. And finally, the third part would be the sepoy legacy today, to see the last vestiges or the shadows of the old story and what remains, like the dinosaur bones of a plesiosaur lying around of the once substantive and ubiquitous story of the sepoys. So, okay, I will begin now. Just like Captain Ramachandran, obviously, and I'm sure, I suspect everyone else here, I had an interest in military history, and I remember reading that Mr. Ramachandran mentioned about Cornelius Ryan and the bridge too far in one of his blogs, you know. So yes, I went down that road too. But the real thing gelled at the Battle Box War Museum at Fort Canning, which is quite a unique museum. It's an underground bomb-proof bunker, which was used by the British Army HQ of General Percival at the time of the Japanese surrender. It's been made into a museum now with state-of-the-art equipment and all that. I had the good fortune to be its curator for 8 years. Now, what has this got to do with the subject matter here? Now, the commander was General Percival, who was in charge of an army. Can anyone hear that interference there?
If in case your mobile phone is right next to you, you might want to just move it away.
Okay. I've moved mine away. I can hear sort of echo here. So General Percival was in charge of a huge army, 140 to 150,000 men, depending on how you do the accounting. And he had about 55 infantry battalions. 2 were Malay, 7 were Australian. Can anyone hear the echoing that I'm hearing? Sorry.
What is the echo?
I can hear a bit of echoing. Can anyone hear it?
Yeah.
Yes, there's quite a bit of echo. Ramachandran sir, can you please mute everybody else except
Yes, Mr. Palani has not muted himself. He's
I have
muted now.
muted him. I have muted him.
Okay.
Okay, so now it seems okay now. So back to Malaya Command. And so I repeat again, we had about 2 Malay regiments, 7 Australian, 15 British, 30 Indian, men from the Indian subcontinent. And we haven't talked about artillery, the pioneers, the sappers and miners, they call them, and their service and support. So we had a large group of Indian troops who were serving under General Percival, and a large proportion of that went into the bag when the Japanese captured Singapore and Malaysia. So many were captured from the Indian subcontinent that when Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose came to Singapore, not everyone joined him, but those that did, well, it was large enough to form a little army, which came to be known as the Indian National Army. So this is the way it went. So although I had to follow the National Heritage Board's narrative of being being one of the staff there, but I did, when I get the chance to appear on TV or whatever, to talk about, to just let slip about the sepoys. And then don't forget that a large number of soldiers here were from the Indian subcontinent. And well, I left the battle box in 2009, but for those from India, you'd be quite interested to see that just a few months ago, on 4th of April, guess who was there? Your former Chief of Army Staff, General Naravane. He visited the battle box and with his family. So that's the kind of stuff you'll see. Now, I left the battle box in 2009. I went into publishing. I wanted to, now I was free to talk about the sepoys. I didn't have to talk about the whole story, but just the sepoys. I tried to approach some people in Malaysia. They were sort of ambivalent. There was apathy based on ignorance, I suppose, incredulity. Perhaps if it's so important, how come we've never heard of this before? And they said I have to do it in Tamil. I felt it was limiting because the story was bigger than any particular vernacular. The story was international, the way I look at it. But anyway, I did it in Tamil, but it is interesting for me because it is a learning curve. I got to do an early version of the slideshow you'll see later. For those who don't understand Tamil, it says Solla Maranda Kade, which means the story that's been forgotten to tell. It gained traction for one day, but there's no momentum. I got in the papers, I got interviewed, but it's a one-hit wonder, as they call it, you know? So there was no follow-up. So people told me, you have to write the book to get into the collective psyche of the people, get into academia, get into the people who form the bulk of the thinking classes and the chattering classes. So after 8 years, I'm skipping a lot of time here. After 8 years, I came up with this book. Well into the 6th year, I realized this story is massive. Believe it or not, this was meant to be an introduction. I really wanted to talk about the sepoys who fought in the Second World War, the battles, as Mr. Ramachandran mentioned, Kampa, and having worked in the battle box, I knew intimately battles that were fought in Southeast Asia involving Indian regiments. And I'm not talking about the ones who came when the Japanese surrendered with Mountbatten. I'm talking about the ones who fought in 1941 and 42. So the idea was to lead the audience, the readership, to understand that there was already a legacy here. And in Singapore particularly, we have a vastly changing demographic. We have a lot of people who have migrated here from elsewhere, and they do not know the history of Singapore really in depth. So they believe what they see, and they don't dig further than that. I wanted them to know there was already a long-standing heritage of sepoys being in Southeast Asia, not just World War II. So the question is, why was Percival having an army full of Indians? I wanted to say they were already there, going back from the late 18th century. So I needed an introduction, maybe a chapter, a few paragraphs, perhaps. And the more thread I pulled, the skeletons came out of the closet, and it just went on and on and on. And by the time I was in my 6th year, a friend of mine told me, Nidhu, I think you better stop it here. Leave World War II. This alone is a standalone story. And that's what I did. It was a brutal choice. I stopped it on the eve of World War I simply because there was too much to tell. We're dealing with I was trying to target the young people too, who don't read books nowadays. It's all smartphones and iPads and the short attention spans. So the longer I waited, the more the story will recede. So it wasn't about Forgotten Sentinels, it's a forgotten story. And that's how it came about. I was very fortunate to get it vetted by a think tank in Cambridge called the Indian Military Historical Society. The president himself did the draft for me. I mean, he went through the draft. I didn't ask him, just like Mr. Muthaya. These are just great gentlemen, even Mr. Ramachandran himself. I just say something and they do the rest without me asking them. He went through the whole draft, which I didn't expect him to do. He was Field Marshal Sir John Chappell, that's him on the left. And he passed away just 2 months ago. And he vetted the book, and he was also the chief of the, if you Google him, you'll see his long list of achievements. He knew Singapore and Malaysia intimately. In 1952, he led a Gurkha platoon, your Gorkhas, and he fought against the communists insurgency in Malaya called the Malayan Emergency. So yeah, I have to say some tribute about him because he played a big role in the early part of the book. Now we come back to the launch of the book, which is the 14th April 2018. I was very lucky to get it done at the former parliamentary chamber, the oldest standing building in Singapore. Nothing in Singapore is really old, unlike India. So nothing goes earlier than 1819. So the foundation was laid in 1826, I believe. In the run-up to the launch, just a few weeks before the launch, I was amazed to find out that the foundations were laid on the spot of an old Malay hut that was flattened. And that was the hut, the very hut with Sir Stamford Raffles and the first sepoy who landed in Singapore came there to open the negotiations to set up a trading post in Singapore. I didn't know that. It's a full circle moment. I mean, I have friends who are spiritual, they go into all kinds of stuff and say, oh, it is meant to be. But it's amazing that almost 1 year to the bicentennial from 1819 to 2019, this is 1 year short, 2018, the book was launched by the very first sepoy from the Bengal Native Infantry, the 20th Marine, they call them because they came on ships, 20th Marine Bengal Native Infantry, and they landed there, and that's where the book was launched. I did, once again, this whole slideshow thing was evolving. I did it. It is a closed audience, dignitaries, diplomats, academics, good close friends of mine, curators, they turned up. And I realized that this is getting somewhere. The Indian High Commissioner to Singapore at the time, His Excellency Javed Ashraf, who is now the Indian Ambassador to France, was there. He read the book in 1 week. I know this because when on stage, he went up on stage and cherry-picked paragraphs and passages from his head. I mean, he didn't have notes. It's quite amazing what he did. That's the way it went. Now, whenever there was any war-related conference, which are few and far between, by the way, I would go there and try to talk about the sepoys. One of them was in Kuala Lumpur on 10th of August. They had a huge conference. The focus is more on the Malayan emergency. For those who are not from Malaysia or Singapore, the communists tried to overtake the government there from 1948 to 1960. And it's an armed insurrection. So many lives were lost. I mentioned about the sepoys. We had reenactment people there. And they were very cute. They bought my book, by the way, and they were quite curious about this whole sepoy thing. Back in Singapore, the Asian Civilization Museum on 7th December, a day of infamy, and a date that has got something to do with World War II. I gave what is truly the first public presentation of the sepoys in Singapore. The book launch was a closed audience. This one was open to the public. Well received, based on the feedback I got. And once again, I was trying to introduce this thing about sepoys. It is almost like a gimmick. People used to look at it almost with a kind of a shock effect, like, how come you've never heard of this before? Some were interested, some were bemused, some were, so that's the way it went, you know. I had to do it, and I persevered. And when I was working the Battle Box, they did not have something called the Indian Heritage Center, which they have now. They had a year-long exhibition in 2019 to 2020, commemorating all the various aspects of the Indian diaspora. So, you know, the Chettiar moneylenders, the Parsis, the Malabar coast merchants, the Sikhs and all that kind of stuff. But I wanted something about the sepoys. Once again, I kept nagging to the people who would bother to listen that we need something about the sepoys. With all the money they had and all the lavish stuff they had, and the infrastructure, why can't we talk about the sepoys? I'll have to tell you the truth. This is all they put in the end. I mean, they put a banner with a sepoy there, with no explanation. Well, there you go. So that's the way it goes. I mean, you'll see. And we had this hologram where I literally haunted the corridors, and they got me talking about the sepoys. I would have rather had pictures of the sepoys themselves rather than me talking. But once again, I was not going to say no, because I would never get a second chance. And I did it. And then we had a television program, a 10-part series on, once again, the various aspects of the Indians coming to Singapore. I did speak to the producer and said, we got to begin with the first part of it about the sepoys again. They did it. It is the first time ever sepoys were featured on a television program in Singapore, and I'm certain in Malaysia too. It is done and well received too. Now, the Battle of Malaya is known for a series of calamities and defeats, which culminated in the fall of Singapore, which Churchill called the worst defeat and largest capitulation in the history of British arms. But people don't realize that once in a while, there were battles where the Japanese were stopped in their tracks. One example is Kampar in central Malaya, where the Japanese just couldn't get past the British and Indian forces. In fact, they eventually outflanked it by going elsewhere. But down the road here at Kampar, they couldn't get past them. Many Indian soldiers fought there, and a particular Sikh company of the 1/8 Punjab fought so well, the English officers said that if they could hand out Victoria Crosses by the bagload, they certainly earned in the day. So we had a function there, and the Indian High Commissioner to Malaysia, Sri Mirdu Kumar, who's now the Indian ambassador to Mexico, graced the occasion. It was held at the Gurdwara Sahib, the Sikh temple at Kampar. For those of you can see on the screen, there's a hill behind. That's where the battle took place. For 3 days, the Japanese Imperial Army was literally defeated, at least locally. But they won the war, but they lost the battle there. Well, they fought them to a standstill, let's put it that way. So I gave, again, a slideshow, which also covered the sepoy legacy. Back to the Indian Heritage Center in Singapore. Now, COVID had broken out. So social distancing, face masks, paranoia, rumors going around about how air conditioning will spread the coronavirus. I was given the option of canceling it. I said no. I'm going ahead with it. And many people came. I mean, it's amazing that given the fear at that time about the virus, which is fast evolving, people did turn up. I gave a little presentation, and you'll see a lady sitting on my left in the screen for you on the right. She was a very famous figure in the field of arts and performance arts in Singapore, Mrs. Santa Bhaskar, a cultural medallion winner and a Hall of Fame winner. And she's the co-founder of the oldest continuously functioning Indian classical dance theater in Singapore. They had done everything: Kuchipudi, Kathakali, Bharatanatyam, Carnatic dancing, you name it. And all their motives were based on Puranas, Bharatanatyam, Bhagavad Gita, Ramayanam. And one day she approached me and said, why don't we do a dance performance using the sepoy story? I was amazed that she even attempted this. I was not going to say no, although I was a bit skeptical. How are we going to do this? She did it. And I gave them permission to use the title of my book, The Forgotten Sentinels. And it was held at the prestigious theaters on the Bay, our Royal Academy, you can call it. And yes, they used an episode from 1795 when the Madras sepoys landed in Malacca, which we will come to later. And she paid tribute to it, and she passed away 2 months in February this year. I'm honored to say that perhaps one of her last projects is where she used my book as an inspiration. Like she's another one. If you Google her, you'll see what she's achieved in Singapore. And there you go. These are just some scenes for you to have a look. Pretend fire rounds are not allowed. I wanted to have them holding guns, but they didn't allow that for some legal reasons. They're very strict in Singapore. So they're standing there pretending to be holding muskets. The tricorn 17th, 18th century hats, literally, I made it myself, handmade by me, simply because I didn't trust anyone to do it. So I'm a bit of an art and craft man. So I made sure they did that. And even the backdrop drawings, it may sound like I'm blowing a trumpet, but I'm just telling the truth. I did those drawings simply because I wanted them to be accurate. That's an East Indiaman ship of a galleon of that period. So I wanted to make sure they got it right, rather than me explaining it to an illustrator. And by the time you pass the information to him, he gets all wrong. Going back to the launch of my book back in 2018, I got word that there was a review of my book in India, because until now, everything I'd done was in Malaysia and Singapore. I was quite curious. A magazine called the Madras Musings, a fortnightly magazine I never heard of. And I got a copy somehow. And lo and behold, there was a very complimentary write-up on the book, and a gentleman by the name of Captain D.P. Ramachandran, the host of this program. And that's him, obviously. So, and of course, the only way he got this book is through Mr. S. Muthia, who, through another friend of mine called Subaya in Singapore, I got to meet him in Singapore on the 7th of June of 2018. He flew off the next day. Yes, and a month later, the book was reviewed. I never got the chance to say thank you because he passed away 9 months after this picture is taken. So that brings us to the end of the first part. Now the show proper. We shall begin with a little attention grabber. Normally with live audiences, that keeps them sort of awake. But the thing is, we have to come down to the real meat. Now, there's no time to go into the whole history, and I'm sure, especially the people from India and the military people there, you would know all this stuff. How the armies evolved. I mean, first with the Madras army with Stringer Lawrence, after the French captured Fort St. George in 1746, and then 1748, the first companies were formed. So we had these uniforms. I'm sure this picture is something you've all seen. It's very popular in many museums now. Some are barefooted, some are wearing sandals or chappals. And of course, the first Lal Paltan, the Red Battalion of the Bengal Native Infantry, on the eve of the Battle of Plassey. Yes. And of course, last but not least, the Bengal Army, the Bombay Army. But they all had one thing in common. They wore the iconic red coat, or coatee, as they call them, based on the 18th century English sartorial design. And of course, they had the same weapons, the old Longland pattern brown bess musket. We'll come to that later. So all the operations in the first few years were within the Indian subcontinent. Now, the 7-Year War broke out in Europe, where France and England, who were fighting each other for almost 100 years, were at loggerheads once again, and all the European empires took one side or the other. The Spanish found themselves on the side of the French against the English. The English said this is the chance to strike at the heart of Spanish economic power around the world. Their main aim was to hit Havana in Cuba. And at the same time, a multi-pronged attack was to strike the center of the tea trade and the China trade in Manila, in the Philippines. Now, to think about the logistics back then, in the age of sail and no GPS systems, it is quite an amazing thing they did back then. We have this picture of the invasion of Havana in 1762. And we don't have too many pictures of the assault on Manila, but the expedition was all formed at Fort St. George. It's Madras. I hope you don't mind. I know it's called Chennai now, but I use the word Madras because that's the way it was called back then. So for authenticity, to be authentic, I would like to stick to the way they mentioned it back then. So Brigadier Draper, William Draper, was in charge of the expedition, and he tried to get 2,000 sepoys. He ended up having 600. As to why, well, that's explained in detail in chapter 2 of my book. And many firsts took place. I mean, here we have these men, the Madrasi guys. I'm sure some of them could not swim, have never been out at sea, cooped up in this little galleon. By the way, the HMS Essex did take part in the assault on Manila. And the sense of adventure, the sense of fear, the Muslims would have thought is you're going to have food that's not halal or compatible with their religion. And they had fears of jinns and devils. The Hindus believed that they would lose their caste. But when you cross the Great Kalapani, you come back to India, you're a persona non grata. You'll be just ostracized. So the volunteers that came were truly people like, traveling to Mars for all the care. They were astronauts. And we don't have pictures of them from 1762, but we have this picture from 1791. It'll give you a sense of what they looked like. And of course, they left on the 1st of August. Once again, many records are broken. The first cross-oceanic voyage, the first to enter the Straits of Malacca. And the English had no foothold in Southeast Asia at the time. The Dutch controlled the trade routes, the old East Indies trade, and they had been in charge of the place since 1641. But Holland was an ally of England, so they allowed the fleet to come here and spend a week there, getting off the stores, taking the sick and those who had seasickness. I'm sure many of the Indians had problems there, and to get fresh water. And after a week, they headed off across literally uncharted waters because they didn't have sufficient maps. And they arrived off Manila on the 24th of September. They laid siege to what was quite a formidable fortress called the Intramuros, a medieval Spanish fort. Now, once again, there's no time to go into details of this whole campaign. I can just skim the surface here. And in operation, that would be still useful. I mean, if you use modern arms today, it is still quite a complex and I mean, a standard amphibious assault with a feint, and the Indian sepoys were deeply involved there. They did a diversionary attack on the right side, and they moved in and they breached the fort after several days on 3 occasions, and they captured the place. The sepoys went on, along with the English, to occupy the place for the next 2.5 years. The way things were fought back then is almost a kind of sense of chivalry, where the royal families, which still controlled government back then, would agree that we will play this chessboard game where you'll do a bargain, you give us that territory, we give you yours, and we can reach a compromise. So at the Treaty of Paris, they swapped certain places, and they decided to hand this back to the Spanish, which sounds strange. But even today, in a province called Rizal, in a district called Cainta, in the suburbs of Manila, there's a legend that descendants of some of the Indian sepoys who had reputedly revolted or mutinied. Now that's another story as to what happened there. They went native, they stayed up behind, and they didn't return back to India. And they intermarried with some of the local women, and their descendants are still there today. But that's a story. Unless they go for a DNA check, we can't prove this, but it's very likely true. So that was a one-off result. It is back to trade, because the East India Company was actually initially formed to create, get a niche, a finger in the pie on the East Indies trade. So trade missions were sent out to Southeast Asia, like this one in Borneo, to the royal court. And for those who are trained to look at these things, like I would say I'm one of them, and I'm sure some of you are, that picture immediately shows you what are sepoys, simply because of the way they dress. They're barefooted, they're wearing that odd hat. And of course, we come down to the Dutch, who held the spice trade at a time when ginger, spice, and things like that were worth their weight in gold in Europe. And of course, the Spanish had their trade to China. The English were obviously allies of Holland, so they didn't want to confront them directly. But they just wanted to get some of their action too. So the Dutch had Malacca. The English went on the downside, the south side of Sumatra, in a godforsaken place called Bencoolen, now known as Bengkulu in today's Indonesia. And they set up a fort called Fort Marlborough in 1714. Now, as you all know, Stringer Lawrence had his first sepoys in 1748. So it's very clear there were no sepoys here at that time. However, if you look at the old paintings from the later 18th century, like this one by Joseph Stadler, who was a very prolific painter of his time, in aquatint. And aquatint is an early version of watercolor painting. At the lower quadrant, the lower quarter, the bottom left, you see the ramparts of Fort Marlborough and some of the government buildings there. But if you zoom in, I mean, one of the artist's techniques back then was to put human beings for perspective, number one, and to give a sense of interest. Now we look at this particular scene here, and the evidence is there for all to see. Yes, sepoys were certainly there by the 1790s until the year 1800. Now, we had to come back to the Straits of Malacca. A man called Captain Francis Light managed to negotiate with the Sultan of Kedah to open up a trading station or factory, as they called it, on the island of Penang. He arrived there with a company of men from the Bengal Army. What's important about this is they were the only organized manpower he had for the first few months. They did everything, unloading the stores, clearing the field. At a time when you had pythons and tigers around, you needed men with guns. And they did everything for them and setting up the foundations of what came to be known as Fort Cornwallis. And they helped set up what came to be known as Penang, the precursor. In fact, modern Malaysia really began from this moment. So there you are. The red dots show you where the British were. Penang and Bencoolen, and Malacca was still under the Dutch. Yes. And the Fort Cornwallis, which later was patrolled by Indian sepoys too. Now, the town plan was sort of evolving now. Even today, if you go to Penang, you'll be able to discern some of these things there. This is 1799. Let's zoom in and have a look. At the top right, you see a star-shaped fort. That is Fort Cornwallis. For those of you who know about a place called Pulikat in India, there's a Dutch fort that looks exactly the same. You can just check it out. And interestingly, the cartographer, the map maker, has these rows of huts there, and he calls it sepoy lines. He spells it S-E-A-P-O-Y. I'm convinced that it's just a Freudian slip because they were soldiers who were traveling on the ships. They didn't use the word Marines back then. So it's just like I said, it's a Freudian slip, but he did mean Indian sepoys. By 1803, the town plan had evolved to such a point they had to move them elsewhere because they had buildings coming in here. They moved them westwards to what is now the Turf Club. Even today, the polo ground is there, and they remain there. Now, coming back to the sepoys themselves, they had this famous gun, the Longland pattern musket, called a flintlock musket called the Brown Bess. It came in different versions. Some were 44 inches long, some 42 inches long. They, on average, they were 10 pounds weight. You can convert it to kilograms if you want to. Sturdy teak. So even if you run out of ammunition, if you take a swing, you could cause some significant damage there. And it required a complex series of actions, which was standard procedure for them. And the French initially, and later the English, found that the Indians were quite dexterous. They had nimble fingers, and they were able to learn these drills, well led and well trained. They were pretty good. I mean, that's actually the words of William Bill Slim in the 14th Army in World War II. He said, well led and well trained Indian troops were good enough to be pitted against anyone in the world. And Claude Auchinleck, the last C of the British Army, of the Indian Army, said that too. So here we have an early version of how they did the drill. They take out the cartridge, they bite off the thing, exposing gunpowder, put it in the pan, and tip up the ball at the muzzle, and they ram it down, and they raise their arms and they fire. So the whole thing had to be done very quickly under pressure, and you get all these men doing it. And by the turn of the 19th century, uniforms were getting more complex. So we had the cavalry, you were getting the sappers and miners, you're getting the signalmen, but the bulk of them, by and large, were still wearing the red coat. Now, the wars in Europe, once again, were having the ramifications in Asia. So revolutionary France had overrun Holland. The Dutch king, William of Orange, was exiled to England. And he signed a treaty with the English and saying that the English will occupy all Dutch forts and factories throughout Southeast Asia, including Malacca and the East Indies. The English obliged. So in 1795, they came to occupy Malacca to preempt the French, because the idea is that the French would try to occupy it. And they used, out of a 2,000-man field force, half of them, 1,000, were from the Madras Army. And going back to the Carnatic dance performance I did with Santa Bhaskar, this was the episode that they were trying to commemorate. For those of you from Malaysia, you would recognize this immediately. That building, these two buildings are still there, St. John's Church in the center and the old Dutch counting house. What's interesting about this painting is that you will see a Chinese hawker on the ground trying to sell his wares to an Indian sepoy with his musket slung over his shoulder. Now, so once again, I repeat, 1795, they occupied the Dutch forts and factories, including Malacca. And guess what? In 1815, with the defeat of Napoleon in the Battle of Waterloo, the time came for the British to return all these things. They were holding them on trust and return it back to the Dutch. So for the politicians, the royal families, this is a good thing. It's a matter of honor. But for the traders and the hardy businessmen who are making a living in the heat and dust of Asia, it meant giving back the commercial power that they had been enjoying for the last 23 years back to the Dutch. What are we going to do once we give Malacca back to the Dutch? One such man was a man called Strafford Raffles, a little clerk in Penang, and he went for a reconnaissance in 1819, south of Malacca to the island of Singapore. On the 29th of January, 1819, he landed here with a famously anonymous sepoy in the middle. You'll never know who this man was, and Major William Farquhar, the now jobless former resident of Malacca. They walked towards the biggest hut there, owned by the Temengong, which is, I suppose, the Indian word would be a local Panchayat leader, the leader, the village headman, to open up negotiations for a treaty to have a little factory there. Now, one more thing I'll tell you, that this is the spot where they later had the Parliament building built, and that's where I had my book launch. So they cleared the field, which they called the Padang, which is the Malay word for the field, and that's where the first barrack was. They were there till about 1823 before they moved elsewhere. And once they moved, that field remained there and became the center of social life in the evenings. People would just get around, go for walks and get to know each other. And this is a famous picture. Anyone from Singapore would recognize this painting. It appears in our history books. It's in the National Museum. The Oil and Canvas by J.T. Thompson from 1851. Now let's focus on this particular group of people here. We have a sepoy. And what I find interesting, he's the only one glaring out at the artist all those years ago, almost defiantly. And thanks to the wonders of modern technology, he's staring out at us almost 200 years later. And we know this. I know that this man is from one of the Madras regiments, because between 1823 and 1872, every regiment that came here was from the Madras Army. So this painting is from 1851. So even if you give or take 1 or 2 years, he's from the Madras Army. There you go. Now, the town plan of Singapore was evolving very fast. The urban explosion was such that they had to move the sepoys from the field south of the Singapore River to this place, which is now the site of the Singapore General Hospital. But for 150 years, and for many generations, that place is called Sepoy Lines. If you can look at the map there, I don't know how clear it is on the screen for all of you. It is actually today what they call Chinatown. And you have Sepoy Lines there, and even they had to move out elsewhere. But there was a regimental hospital there. That remained behind, and that's the seed, the genesis of what later came to be the General Hospital of Singapore. I'm simplifying the whole story, but that's all I can say in the few minutes we have here. Now, we have these old pictures here. Technically, it's inaccurate because this picture shows what happened during the Opium Wars, but they were similar, they're contemporary. So the lines that we have in Malaysia and Singapore were quite similar. Thatched huts, men lying on the floors. Sometimes they use the word cantonment lines. Cantonment lines were interchangeable with sepoy lines. Barracks were for European troops, sepoy lines for Indian troops. Cantonment lines also include people from the bazaar contingent, the chaiwalas, the dobiwalas, the nautch girls. They don't talk about it, but I'm sure they were. The leather people, the people who were looking after the horses. Now, these people are staying in the cantonment. So it is all one little ecosystem. Yes, stores and granary. Now, the first time combat operations, until now they were just doing guard duties, was in 1831 at a place called Nanning. There is a place in China called Nanning too, but in English they spell that with two N's. The Malaysian one is N. It's all about maps, just like any war, even we have today in what's happening in Ukraine. Yes, borders around India too. You draw a map. People there don't realize what these maps mean. The high-handle officials in Malacca said, okay, you're within our territory, we're going to tax you. Tell that to the locals there, they were not going to pay tax. And you had a stubborn group called the Minangkabau. They are a proud race of people who look Malay, but they're not. They have roots that go back to Indonesia. So they have their own distinctive clothing, distinctive culture. They refused to pay it, the tax that was demanded of them. One thing led to another. There was a war. It's a very unjust war. Even the English admitted too. Well, caught in the middle were the loyal sepoys. The Madras regiments were sent in one after another. This is the first time that these odd tunics were used in the heat and dust of Malaysia. And yeah, I mean, part of the problem was actually negotiating the jungle there. By sheer attrition, they got the Minangkabau to submit themselves. It was a very unfair war, but I'm not going into the morality of everything. My purpose of this slideshow is to give service record. I let people argue till the cows come home about the morality of it all. And here's another one of that examples, the Opium War, 1839 to 1842. The thing is, many Madras regiments were sent there. I didn't know that till I came to this out-of-print book, which I found in the UK. And every regiment that went to China passed through the Straits settlements. They got off at Penang, Malacca, and Singapore, spent a few days there, got their stores, did the rifle drills, and headed off to China. They won battle after battle, and for those who are adept at recognizing them, as I'm one of them, by the headgear, these are sepoys there. These are the English Royal Marines on the right there. Second Opium War was the same thing too. Once again, they passed through the Straits of Malacca, they passed through Singapore and Penang and Malacca, and but this time, for the first time, they had Sikh regiments. After the Anglo-Sikh War, and of course earlier than that, the breakup of the empire of Maharaja Ranjit Singh. It's a sociological thing, a cultural thing. There's no time to discuss it here. Many Sikhs joined, and they got along well. The British loved them, and they loved the British, and they turned out to be very good soldiers for them. They were sent to China, they did the job they were given, and they came back victorious. Once again, I will let the audience here figure out for themselves. There's no time here. And back in Malaysia and Singapore, well, the Straits settlements, gang warfare and criminal behavior was rampant. And this is a time where the police force was inadequate. You didn't have policemen, by the way, to begin with. So you needed a paramilitary force. You needed a man who was a bit more than a policeman, but less than an infantryman. The sepoys on guard duty were perfect for this. So yes, lots of criminals, wild people from India, Malaysia, and Indonesia had arrived there. Criminals running away from from things that are happening back home. And then you had gang warfare. The Chinese had different clans. They spoke different languages, some of them, the Hokkien and Teochews, in the days before they came up with Mandarin to make everyone speak the same language. These clans were quite vicious. They had their own secret societies. And it all came about controlling the manpower to deal with the English, because the Englishman didn't care. He wanted the warehouses unloaded. He needed 500 coolies. And so the headman comes to him and says, I'm going to give you 500 coolies. And then you have a rival coolie saying, I've got my own 500 men. So it is a turf war. The fighting got so bad that the port operations came to a standstill. The warehouses were threatened. Lives were killed. And it came to a point where even the English governor was told one day, guess who brought in law and order? Many Madras regiments. I've listed out the regiments that got involved, and they cleared the streets in a very firm manner. Yes, now we're entering the age of photography. So we have one or two pictures. Up north in Malaya, they found huge deposits of tin. And the discovery of tin coincided with the Industrial Revolution in the West. Prices went up. Instant millionaires were being made. Even the Malay Rajas decided to get a piece of the pie. They didn't care as long as they get our commission. So once again, the gang rivalry between the Chinese gangs got out of control. Now, at the same time, in 1872, something happened in Singapore and Malaysia. For some administrative reason, the last sepoy regiment in 1872 was sent back to India and replaced by an English regiment. So he had no sepoys in Malaya and Singapore at that time. And the gang warfare got out of control the year after the sepoys left. One can speculate whether this had anything to do with it. I mean, the Chinese gangsters were very cunning. The moment they realized the sepoys had gone, probably they had the free hand now to start doing what they wanted. A man called Captain Speedy said, we need people, shock troops, to come and put an end to this thing. He rushed back to the Punjab and brought in the first organized Sikh units into Singapore and Malaya. He formed something called the Perak Armed Sikhs, or the Perak Armed Police. And in 1875, they had the Perak Wars, by the way, which began with the assassination of the first English resident. Now that we're getting into politics here. He was killed because when they put down the riots, they had to have a guy to advise the Malay Rajas on how to run the show. I mean, because the Malay Rajas were quite corrupt themselves. So they were colluding with the Chinese gangsters. It is very complex here. And then he was killed. When this man was killed, J.W. Birch, they had to bring in more troops. And for the very first time, they brought in the Gurkhas, who are also now getting involved in affairs in India. So the Sikhs and the Gurkhas are making their appearance, and they arrived here. The Sikhs arrived as policemen. The Gurkhas came as infantry, and they got involved in the 1875 war. When the things were put down and law and order established, the Gurkhas were sent back. The Sikhs remained behind, and they became the Perak Sikhs. And in Taiping was the headquarters. It's a place in central Malaya. And if you go there today, this field is still there. I remember standing at this field and picturing the scene in my head. Criterion for joining this unit was very strict. You had to be 6 feet tall. Now, in the 19th century, to reach 6 feet tall is quite amazing. So they had a dual purpose. They were also parade men. They were like human mannequins. And the royal families of Malaya, the sultans or the rajas of the Malay kingdoms used to keep them as bodyguards like mannequins. They were dressed in regalia, pomp and ceremony, and they took part in great parades. Coming back to China, the Boxer Rebellion of 1900 that went on to 1901. A huge Indian garrison was sent there. Almost 18 to 20,000 men were involved, all passed to Singapore, Penang, and Malacca. One of the procedures was stand and take pictures of themselves. These are men from the Madras regiments. Many Sikhs were involved there. In fact, men from all over India were involved in the Boxer Rebellion. I've given a list of the regiments in my book. There's no time to go into the actions there. Temple of Heaven's Gate. This is a famous landmark even today in Beijing. And here you have the Bengal Lancers posing at this famous monument. And Count von Waldersee, the Prussian commander of the multinational force, went in to get the terms of surrender. He entered the Meridian Gate into the Forbidden City. And guess who were his escorts? The Bengal Lancers. It's a scene that is straight out of the biblical movies, you see. And here you have a Sikh regiment with a bagpiper, with a band there leading their way through Beijing. And once again, parade was also part of it. I think in the age before cinemas and handphones, it was a big thing for people to go out and watch these military parades. So whenever something happened, like a visit of a royal family or a dignitary, you'll have the sepoys coming down. So the Perak Sikhs were sent down to Singapore to welcome these people. The 16 Madras native infantry with the bands went up to the seafront. For those who are from Singapore, any Singaporeans watching this is near the General Post Office or the Fullerton Bay Hotel. And there you go. You can see the huge crowds watching this. It's the nearest thing for entertainment for them. Sir Henry Keppel, who played a huge role in identifying the famous port of Singapore today. For those who speak Tamil, you may have heard the story that Kappal, which is the Tamil word for ship, well, it's just one of those great coincidences, a phonetic coincidence. No, I'm sorry, Keppel Harbour was not named because of the word Keppel, of Kappal, the Tamil word. It's because Sir Henry Keppel, that's his actual name, was the man who identified this zone, and he played a huge role in fighting piracy in the 1840s and 1850s. His last trip to Singapore, he's being sent off here by men from the British Marines and the sailors and soldiers from the Madras Regiment. He went back to England and he passed away the next year, in 1904. And yes, once again, they were so part and parcel of life in Singapore. Once again, those who know Singapore, this is the Singapore Art Museum, or for many years, St. Joseph's Institution, the famous boys' school. And once again, I'm addressing this to Singaporeans watching this. This is the site of the Singapore Management University. The field is still there, and you can see them with this band. And then, of course, we came to World War I. Now, in terms of operations, nothing much happened in Singapore and Malaysia. All the action was in Europe. European regiments were being sent there, and they were sucked into the killing fields of Flanders and the Somme and Verdun and Gallipoli. And eventually they were using Indian regiments. Eventually more than 1 million Indian soldiers were involved there. But nothing much happened in Malaysia and Singapore. Now, I hate to disappoint everybody, but this is the point where I ended my book. And I'm trying to stick to the format of my book by coming to a halt here, with all due respect, simply because the next stage of the story was too big, going on to World War II. And so we've reached the end of the second part, the slideshow, and we're going to the third part, the Sepoy legacy today. I hope I'm within the time here of the slideshow. Now, it's almost like you find a dinosaur bone in the middle of nowhere, giving an indication that there was something larger once here before. So right in the heart of Chinatown, you have a Sikh temple and a Vinayagar Ganesha temple, not too far apart, in the midst of Chinatown. And you don't have an Indian population to support their existence. It's almost like an anomaly. I'll give you an example. The Siddhi Vinayagar, they call it the Lion Siddhi Vinayagar temple. Now, the word lion for years was a kind of a mystery to me. The Malays thought it's an Indian word. The Indians thought it's a Malay word. And those who understand how words get corrupted in Singapore, they call it Singlish. They thought it's a Malay pronunciation for the word lion city, lion being Singa, Singapura. I have a theory, which I've yet to be, I'll like to see if anyone can disprove it, that this is because this is all part of the lines. These two temples were actually within the area of the old cantonment lines or sepoy lines. And so when say, I'm going to that Vinayagar temple or that Ganesha temple, which one are you going to? I'm going to the one in the lines of the Siddhi Vinayagar. Once again, it's a theory of mine, but I'd like to see someone disprove it. And well, there you go. I'm sort of confident I'm correct about this. And that's Pearl's Hill behind. We'll come to that later. Now, going back to the 1870s, when we saw an influx of Sikh personnel in Perak because of all the gang wars going on there, the same things were happening here. And they were more in the policing role than the infantry role. And everywhere they went, they set up a Gurdwara Sahib or a Sikh temple. And they did this at Pearl's Hill. And here's a picture of them at Pearl's Hill, which is also adjacent to where the present-day Singapore General Hospital is. And I mentioned earlier that the last Sepoy regiment left in 1872, but the barracks was still there. The Sikh policemen occupied it now. Now, to the Malays and the Chinese and the locals who lived there, they didn't know the intricacies of the differences between sepoys. To them, they saw men from India, turbans, speaking different languages, occupying sepoy lines. To them, they were sepoys. So to the kind of people who lived back then, these were sepoys too. Yes, the Silat Road Sikh temple for many years was known as the Police Gurdwara. Today, it's a splendid Silat Road temple, but there again, there's a long connection. It's right next to the old sepoy lines. Now, the Mariamman temple is the oldest South Indian Hindu temple here, built here in 1827 by a man called Narayana Pillai. This picture was taken in 1967. It's a color picture. At the base, you'll see human beings. So you'll have a sense of scale. The statues up there are huge. I mean, they're the size of the human beings in the ground. Now let's zoom in and have a look. Now this is quite strange. If you're into temples, this is really quite strange. You're going to see a sepoy. Another one all over the place. I mean, I don't think of too many Hindu temples where you have sepoys guarding them. If you're going to go around looking for them, don't waste your time, because in 1971, they were removed. I'm just telling you that. As to why or how, I don't know. They were removed, and you don't have them today. Chinese businessmen, those who made a huge pile, were very superstitious about their money. And they believed that if they go back into the afterlife, they need their guards to follow them. Guess what? This particular gentleman, Chiu Kyok Leong, made his pile, died a millionaire. He had this grand funeral, and he had sepoy guards, sepoy Nikes. And it's written in Chinese on the butt of the musket, city guard, petrol guard. And if you go further into the bush, you'll see more. So that's the kind of thing they had, the kind of respect they had for them. If you go across the causeway to Malaysia, on the North-South highway, even today, it's spelled in a different way, Jalan Sepoy. Jalan means road, Sepoy Road. There you go. And I've asked around, nobody knows what it means, but I know what it means. If you go to Penang, you'll see Jalan Sepoy lines. Same again, Jalan means avenue, the road of the sepoy lines. This is where the old parade ground was. So Fort Cornwallis, where the first sepoys were guarding back in the 1880s and onwards, is still there today. But there's no indication about the sepoys, but those who know the history will be able to imagine them walking around the ramparts. Which brings us to the end of this whole presentation. But it's not the end of the sepoy legacy, because the story was to go on to World War II. It's a massive story, and there is simply no time here. And of course, Netaji Subhash Chandra Bose, and if you go to Kranji Cemetery, you see a row after row of men of the 11th Indian Division buried there. And then Mountbatten's troops that came after the war and took the Japanese surrender. Hundreds of thousands of Indian sepoys came here, and they sent back the Japanese. And my father lived through that period, by the way, which also goes back to why I'm interested in this whole topic. My dad lived through the Japanese invasion, saw the bombings, saw the Indian sepoys, and he was forced to become a Japanese translator on the infamous bridge on the River Kwai. He was the age of 16. What else can you do? When you see the British Army surrender, you're just a schoolboy. So I grew up in endless tales of the Second World War, and that, for everyone, brings me to the end of the presentation.
Thank you very much. It was a wonderful, I mean, it's just not the book, I mean, your journey with the book, everything so extremely covered. I'm sure you'll be happy to answer some questions the participants have. Ladies and gentlemen, the question hour is open. You can shoot your questions. Please unmute yourself and
I just have a comment, sir. I mean, this is one of the best examples of storytelling I have ever seen.
Thank you.
Being in the corporate world, there's so much emphasis on storytelling and how to, retain the attention of your audience, and I was spellbound.
Thank you.
My heartiest compliments, sir. Brilliant.
I appreciate that.
I have just one question, sir.
Shoot, I'm listening.
Where can we get a copy of the book? It's not on Amazon, that I know for sure. So for those of us who are interested, we can.
I'm actually going to ask a friend of mine, a couple of friends of mine here, including a man called Mr. Nandan, who just blocked his picture. They've been egging me on, including another friend of mine. I recognize one or two names there who are mysteriously hiding their faces. So they're quite shy, which is strange. Yes, I have people who are telling me to do that. I guess I've done everything this side. I've forgotten the forgotten sentinels, yeah, so to speak. There is a blind spot. I am a bit of an eccentric, so I'm not perfect. I will try to get it out on Amazon soon. I know that. I know this. I see the fault. I stand. I mean, my father's passed on. He's no longer around, but he used to scold me for this. I agree. Yes, it has to be out on Amazon soon. Thank you, Mr. Ramakrishnan.
More questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Subramanian, I am civilian, I am not a military man.
Go ahead.
I have got only one. See, the Tamil language was there in Singapore and Malaysia, but the Sikhs were also there. Why they have not brought the Punjabis in Singapore, Malaysia?
I misunderstood.
No, Tamil is the official language in Singapore and Malaysia.
Yeah.
Why Punjabi was not there? Because Sikhs were doing a lot of jobs.
Actually, we're going now into the sociological side, I was trying to stick to the military narrative here. And this is another thing, I mean, with all due respect, sir, I also feel, I mean, I'm speaking as, although I'm Indian ethnically, I grew up in Singapore. So I'm not in a position to tell people who are true blue Indians because you're living there. I can't tell you anything about how things are done. But the way I look at it is one of the reasons why the sepoy story is never told is because of certain subtle suspicions and certain rivalries. People couldn't get together to share and pool their resources and get the story done. So I was trying to stick to writing it without any partiality. I was trying to keep it an open book. And yes, I had to try have a kind of a non-Indian approach. I wanted to be free of the parochial, the how shall I put it, the tribalism, which is always endemic. Sorry to say, I mean, my father used to complain that the lack of unity even among the Tamils. I mean, you'll be surprised, So it never ends, But anyway, I'm not in a position to really answer your question because I was here to talk about the sepoys and the service record. And ironically, it's easier to talk about this. Like even when I was in the UK with British officers, it's quite easy to talk about it. But when you come to the Indians, it gets complicated here and there. But I'll just try to answer that. I mean, I do know a bit of that. They came as military personnel, but by and large, the largest influx of people were from South India, in Malaysia, Singapore. Mr. Subramaniam, are you from India or Malaysia?
Yeah, I am from Tamil Nadu.
Okay. So you're asking why is not Punjabi the official language? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, because they do a lot of jobs to the Sultan.
Okay, yeah. Well, politically, I mean, because of the legacy of Malaysia and Singapore, with the hundreds of thousands of South Indians and particularly a lot of Tamils and a lot of Telugus who spoke Tamil, by the way, at that time, because they're part of the Madras presidency. And I remember in school, many of my Malayali friends whose roots are from Kerala spoke very good Tamil. And funny enough, I suppose because they just work harder, their Tamil turned out to be better than some of the Tamils. So for many reasons, the Tamil became the official language of Singapore and even in Malaysia. That's the way it is. Now we get into the realms of politics, and I'm not in a position to make too many comments to that, because I want to keep this whole forum about the sepoys and the service record. Because the way I look at it, all of them from all over India served, every one of them from different parts. I remember when I approached somebody in Singapore, he asked me, is this book about any particular group of Indians? I said, no, if they served, they're in the book. I repeat, I quote myself, if they served, they're in the book. In other words, I gauged their behavior based on what they did. And if they served, they fought and they died or did an honorable job, they deserve to be in the book. So that's the way I approach the book. And I know there's a lot of revisionism now, and there's a lot of anti-colonialism. I agree, I understand that part. But to be fair, I mean, at the risk of antagonizing some people here, I find that there were people, certain English people who got along well with certain types of Indians too. They were just open-minded enough to accept them. You know, they didn't have the problem of, they could walk in any part of India and talk to any Indian. Whereas the Indians will have a little problem with that village, this particular region, and that, which also helped to the reason why I feel Europeans could come and just walk hell for leather around, just walk around India. I mean, because they were free. You know, they were just, you know, free to walk around and talk around. Whereas the Indians all had a suspicion among, so ironically, different shades of brown skins, and they were just eyeing each other with suspicion here. Once again, I might be antagonizing people here, and I got to be very careful how I talk here. So I think I'd rather not proceed along these lines. And I don't want to tarnish the venue that we have here and Mr. Ramachandran's efforts to get this thing done here.
Okay. Thank you.
I don't think this is the place to talk about that issue. That's all I'm trying to say, you know. But it's a good question, but there is an answer for that, but there's no time for that here.
The other question, yeah, please.
Something.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Geeta from Malaysia. Congratulations, Nedu. That was an amazing presentation. My early concern had been how you were going to make such a compilation succinct and at the same time interesting for the audience. And I must say that you have done a remarkable job with your narrative today. And that presentation was awesome. Right. Now, I don't have a question for you as such. Now, as a former teacher and one who is constantly in touch with young people, yeah, my passion is always about how we are going to take such matters to the younger generation, to younger people. Yeah, considering your book is about that size, and I'm sorry, I've not read it. I mean, I've only got to know about this in recent times and in COVID times at that. So I've not had the opportunity of reading your book. So, but I am assuming anything of that size is highly exhaustive and academic, and will not necessarily be attractive to a generation that is so used to history that is taught in schools, which is agenda bound, or if not, whitewashed, right? So it is, I mean, if this is something that is an eye opener for someone in my 50s like myself, where I'm thinking, you know, how is it going to be for my daughter's generation, for instance? Now, how are we going to get this information such as this to the next generation? You know, who will be daunted by the fact that this is all highly academic or boring and all. And you have already crossed that barrier today with this presentation, in that you managed to beautifully put your narrative across to us within that time frame of an hour. So I remember once, in the one time that I met you, actually telling you, perhaps, you know, you could turn the Forgotten Sentinel, especially now that I've heard you speak so well. You are a natural storyteller as well. So with your exhaustive knowledge and your storytelling skills, perhaps you could turn your book into something that will be more attractive and more succinct and simpler, that will have a wider reach among the impatient generation, let's put it that way. That's all I wanted to say. Thank you, Nedu.
Okay.
And thank you to
I'd like to make a few remarks about that. I was well aware that we're dealing with the E generation, people with short attention spans. And I remember friends of mine cynically saying, Nedu, nobody reads books anymore. You know, so it is quite discouraging to hear people say that. Now, here's the problem. If I don't write a book, the academics and the how shall I put it, don't take it seriously. There is a certain sense of academic arrogance, for want of a better phrase, a sense of like, oh, it's not been researched, it's not been written down, can be taken seriously. So you have to have a pillar, a foundation, a corpus of knowledge around which you can play games later. I mean, you can make light-hearted versions of the main thing. So you need a foundation. And because there was no book that covered the sepoy record in Southeast Asia, there are books on the records of sepoys in India. I mean, Captain Ramachandran himself has authored many books, and I'm sure there are some in the audience here who've written books which I'm not aware of. There are books on the sepoys, and now there's interest about what they did in World War I and elsewhere. But Southeast Asia, zero. Those who had access to my books would have noticed I've spliced in images. I added color. Okay, I might as well admit it here. I designed the book. I didn't trust the illustrators. I wanted the book. I knew exactly what you're talking about. It shouldn't be some big, thick tome, a little monument that will lie molding away on a shelf. Once you buy it and prompt and it becomes a paperweight. No. I wanted a book that can be carried on no larger than an iPad. Yes, it's actually the size of an iPad. And I did that deliberately. Some people have complained the font is a bit small. Had I made it larger, the book would have become thicker. That's the thing. I did toy with these ideas. Color, imagery, font, all that. Yes, it was to attract, to make it attractive and visually captivating to the younger generation. Yes, I know that. Secondly, once you get the story down, you may have seen that in my slideshow, I've attempted to get it through other media like drama, TV, speeches. I'm trying in my own way, but there's only so much one can do. I need the cooperation of people in the media. People, they don't seem to see it too. And that's the problem I faced. I still face it even in Singapore. They are not convinced of the story. They're not convinced of the viability of the story. They feel that rather than doing a drama, if I'm a TV producer, I'll rather do a drama on music and dance than a story about the sepoys, when there are endless possibilities. As Captain Ramachandran, I know, he's an aficionado of war films. We could do endless stories of this, drama series and war and things like that. Historical dramas like Gone with the Wind, which use the American Civil War as the backdrop for a romantic story. I mean, there are endless things that could be done. But I don't know why, for some reason, yes, I'm not here to talk about Indians from India, but Indians in Malaysia and Singapore are apathetical. They're just not interested, or they don't see the purpose or the point of it all. So I did what I could. I had to do it. I can die in peace now, but you know, that's all. I'll just live by what I've done. You know, that's it. I understand the problem that you're talking about. How do you make it interesting to the young people? Get into the media, getting slideshows like this, perhaps, getting it into, you know, some kind of into the collective psyche. There are many ways to do it. You know, it is a challenge. It is a challenge. It can be surmounted. It can be. I don't think it's, if anything, I think it's a very exciting possibility. I think I've said enough here. Gentleman there, I was probably waiting there to go home, maybe. I don't know what time it is in India now. So,
if I could add something to your point, I mean, it's not a problem exclusive for Malaysia or Singapore. Indian subcontinent, which has produced the largest volunteer armies for the 2 world wars. The younger generation is just not aware, I mean, about this. I mean, this is what the problem we have been trying to do something about. You know, all our programs are oriented towards attracting youth. We have intercollegiate military history quizzes. We have children's painting competition, and all these things we do. But just unless the government chips into this, there is no way. We have represented to the government, to the Ministry of Human Resources, that military history be made a part of the curriculum. But I don't think it is being taken seriously. In European countries, they have it. We don't have it. So unless children are taught from a very early stage, you know, that military history taken seriously, it's not taken seriously in this subcontinent, or probably Southeast Asia, from what she says now. So that's what I would comment on.
If I may take a risk here by saying something, I don't know whether I'm correct. I find that there's a deep-rooted sense of pessimism, in a sense, a deep-rooted fear that this will lead to arrogance or a certain character of dominion They have this fear, which I think is unfounded. I remember when I was in the UK, I loved going to the National Army Museum, the Imperial War Museum. I was in France, they had the military museums there. Even in Amsterdam, they had their own military museums too. So it's part and parcel of life. It's nothing. There's nothing to fear about it. That it happened, and that's the way it was.
You're very right. The sense of pacifism is, it has been deep-rooted in it. It has to be taken out.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, that's what exactly, when Aparna was doing the profiling, what she was saying. You see, every other human activity has got heritage organizations in India, but the military doesn't get that privilege. So unless we started this first time, this is a problem. This is not taken as a somehow the I would say Indians or probably Asians. I mean, we feel it is this is kind of not to be taken seriously. Military history, as they say, so God and soldiers are remembered only at times of crisis. That could be that's kind of attitude.
I would like to add one more thing. In my 8 years working at the Battle Box Museum, the vast bulk of visitors came from Europe, from Japan, even China, Indonesia. The delegates, hardly any from India. I had 1 or 2 retired officers of the type I can see. I mean, they have the certain aura that some of you have just by looking at although I can only see you in squares on my screen, they had a certain look. I had a retired general from the Indian Army who came there. So they are like you. They knew the stuff, but they're more like a microcosm. They're more from a section of Indian society, a military group. He lived in a place called Defense Colony in Delhi. So they come from that group. So they know the stuff. But the others, the businessmen, the fintech industry, the guys in the banks, they don't care. They're here to make money, drive their Ferraris and go off to God knows what. So you'll see them in Singapore, but with all due respect, there are many quick millionaires from India and Singapore, young fellas, and running around. So the thing is, they don't know or don't care about this whole thing, And so when I was in the Battle Box, I remember that. And even when I went to overseas, when I was in the Imperial War Museum, I often found myself to be the only Indian there in the group. In fact, I went so often that the security guard said, "Oh, not you again, mate." So he could remember me because I was probably the only Indian who came there. And that's the way it goes, And they have a good display of Indian Army stuff. I mean, especially the National Army Museum at Chelsea. They have all the stuff about the Indian Army, and there are no Indians looking at it. The irony, it's surreal. It's like a scene from the Twilight Zone. You have all the stuff about Indian troops in the British Museum, in the National Army Museum in Chelsea, and you don't see any Indians there. You'll see Caucasian white children looking at that and taking photographs and going off. I mean, they don't allow photography at the time, so taking notes and on school trips. So that's the thing. That it's not part of the education system in India. They don't see the need for it. They don't see the relevance of this in the curriculum, or they don't see any sense of empathy with it. They don't see the whole point of it all.
Not the report.
Yeah. But I'm not, I may sound pessimistic here, but I'm not pessimistic myself. Maybe I don't come across so well on the screen now. I wrote this book because I had this self-imposed generator within me. So it never ends, that enthusiasm. But what I'm saying is for the others out there who are my age or younger, much younger than me, they don't know about this, They are unaware of this whole thing. And particularly, like I said, I myself didn't know there was such a huge sepoy legacy. I knew about the stuff about the Second World War. I mean, it was pretty obvious that Subhash Chandra Bose was able to get at least 40,000 men just from the prisoners alone, And if you include those who did not join the INA, we talk about 60,000 to almost 70,000 men. And of course, Mountbatten later brought in a huge army to reoccupy Southeast Asia. So I always knew about this. But going back to the 19th century, going back to the 1780s, I didn't realize there were so many men from the subcontinent who got involved here. I really didn't know that. In fact, when I was doing my history in school, even any Singaporean will tell you this. We talk about the founding of Singapore and Raffles lands in Singapore. They will just mention one word only on one occasion. Raffles came with a sepoy. And I remember once a student asking a Chinese friend of mine, saying, what is sepoy? Oh, Indian soldier serving the British, with the kind of Singlish accent that they speak in Singapore. And that's it. And trust me, it never comes out in the exam. I mean, it's something that they mention in classroom, and that's the end all and be all of the 200-year-old sepoy legacy. One word, 1 second in a classroom. That's it. So I grew up thinking that's it. Yeah, it's probably 1 or 2 guards who came here and they, and they just stood there and then they disappeared. And I never dreamt one day I'll write this book. Honestly, I really didn't know. It evolved along the way. I just realized, like I said, I pulled the thread and more kept coming out. It just kept coming. And it snowballed into this book. So I surprised myself. Yeah.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes.
I'd like to ask, sir.
Yeah, please.
Yeah. Two. One is a comment and one is a question. The comment is a suggestion, really. Perhaps you could consider, comic book version of your book. Maybe take segments of episodes in your book, which could be turned into a comic book, which is something young students might be more interested to look at as a comic. And the second suggestion was video games are very popular with youngsters. I see that something like a battle reenactment in a video game would be something that you will be able to get their attention much better than perhaps you would in a book form, or even in a drama or a theater performance form. I think students, we need to sort of put the information out in a manner or format that the students would be comfortable using it firstly, and also happy to play around with it. So I think something like a video game format, if you can come up with a video game about certain episodes in your book, like a reenactment where the student has the controls of controlling the outcome of the battle or something like that, when they're playing that game or something like that, I think that might be something that will really attract youngsters towards a topic like this also, I feel. My question was really to understand if the Singapore Army that exists today, do they have at all a Madras regiment? Do they have, or a Sikh regiment as part of it? Like we have the Gorkha regiment even now, and is there something like that? Or even the British Army, in fact, still has the Gorkha regiment. So does the Singapore Army have anything like that at all currently, or did that end with the British once the colonial era ended and Singapore got its independence?
Yeah. First of all, there are many interesting points you brought up, which I'll come later. I'll begin with the end and then I'll go back to the beginning. First of all, no, in Singapore, the narrative is the national narrative. So they have the Singaporeanness. So you subsume your racial identity for the national identity of being a Singaporean. And I believe that that's the same thing in Malaysia too. Whether people follow it in their hearts is another thing. But the point is, there is the idea of a Singaporean army. So I did my national service. I was in a platoon with 30 Chinese guys around me. So the thing is, I did the same training as they did. There was no Madras regiment. No, it's not sectional. And it has a different history, a different legacy. It was created from scratch, literally in 1967. They got together, these people, and created a national army. And at the time, we had a very dynamic leader called Lee Kuan Yew. And he did say that at that time, he kept on saying that, you're not Chinese or Malay or Indian, you're all Singaporean. In a sense, he was replicating what Netaji said. And my father, at the age of 16, attended one of his speeches where he said, you're not Punjabi, you're not Marathi, you're not Gurkhali, you're not Madrasi, you're all Indian. And my father said that's the first time he heard someone say, you're all Indian. He addressed this huge crowd in Penang. My father was there and he saw him talk and he said, you're not Madrasi, you're not Punjabi, Gurkhali, you're Indian. So in a different version, Lee Kuan Yew, who was well aware of Netaji, trust me, he's a brilliant man himself. He took that motif and he's smart enough to come up with his own ideas to have this national identity. So the theory sounds good. Of course, when in practice, people have the emotions, the tribal pull is strong, or sometimes it's a temporary thing. You can move towards that pan-national identity, but over some time, there's a retrograde, regressive pull. that goes back, and then people fall back into their old tribal practices for some reason or other. And this is the cycle of humanity, I suppose. I'd like to go back to an earlier point you made. You mentioned about cartoons. Have you seen my book? You are, my point is I'm an artist too. I can draw. And in fact, in school, I was famous for drawing soldiers and toys and tanks. So it is one of those pet topics that I want to do. I want to try that. Maybe if I get a publisher, I'll try to do a little comic series on sepoys. Who knows? You know, that's the whole thing. And I think Captain Ramachandran has seen some of my drawings in the book. But those were more serious kind of drawings. They were not caricatures. They were meant to portray, in the absence of photography, I had to do a serious reproduction of the drill, or for example, the way the mannerisms of soldiers of that time. And I had to be true to the art of that time too. It wasn't a fantasy drawing, something that came out of the figment of my head. And they'll say, oh, Naidu is trying to invent stories. No, it's a history book, so it had to be serious too. So the drawings had to be subtle, had to complement the text. So that's the way. But coming back to what you're saying, it's a good idea. And the video game stuff is also good too. But there again, I think it has to go back to India. India has all these tech guys who are software engineers who are making big money in America. I think if you can get those guys in to gel with the sepoy thing, but the problem is most of them are probably not interested in the stuff. You know, I don't know. Maybe you know them better than me. Yes, if you can gel those two, video games, artwork, and the sepoy legacy, you'll have a story ready to go. Okay, so
thank you, but thank you so much for the
sure, it's a very good suggestion.
It's really, really good.
Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? We're running short of time.
Yeah, just to emphasize, just to emphasize, I think Apna was mentioning something about animations, you know, which I truly agree would be the way forward in terms of projecting the story for the sepoys. So I really think that's a good idea. Animations, you know, in the future, if you want to do that, that would be really great.
There is a comic book publisher in India. I don't know if you've heard of them, Amar Chitrakatha. You might want to get in touch with them, and they might be willing to do a series on the sepoy stories. They might be interested. They are based in Karnataka, the state of Karnataka. They are traditional comic publishers. They publish a lot on mythological characters from India's history and so on. So that is a publisher that you might want to get in touch with, Amar Chitrakatha.
As a matter of fact, Aparna, I mean, you just come in, we don't know. We already have another group working on a children's book within Colors of Glory. It has not been, we have created, we had a DAV school roped in for these children, you know, it's based on my book on all the battles of Indian Army. And that I wrote it with a target readership of university students. So we made a team to take it into a language palatable for the children. We have come up to that stage. Then we had an excellent sketch artist, Srishti by name. In fact, when I was giving a talk in Madras Literary Society about Second World War, you know, I was talking about Battle of Monte Cassino. And when I finished the talk, this came on the screen as sketch of Monte Cassino. I said, "What is this?" So he said, "One of our artists." So I said, "Your name is Srishti. I mean, really creative." And I said, have you seen this Monte Cassino, the monastery? He said, "No, sir, I had an idea of monastery." He said, so, but unfortunately, she had to go for a postgraduate course in Frankfurt. So it is stuck. Now we have been trying, three artists have tried, nobody is able to grab that. You know, this is Amar Chitrakatha and all. The problem is, you know, these are, we spoke to them also. Bring it out in a rate it works out for students, it doesn't work. It's all corporate organizations. We're working on it. We have a project. I mean, just I'll update you on this later. Yeah. Now, yes, excellent idea. Any more questions, ladies and gentlemen? I've been please shoot. Otherwise, the chat box incidentally, Nadu is full of you know, comments appreciating your talk.
Yeah.
Wonderful person. That is why Aparna herself, wonderful presentation, most absorbing and riveting session. I believe this is the best of all COG presentations. So says Wing Commander Ravi Mani. And then fascinating talk by Mr. Nedumaran. My compliments. This is coming from Krishna Sampath Brigadier. Then we have this one, a Russian sender. She must be there. It must be Ms. Evgenia. I mean, she's from Russian sender. I saw her. I mean, there she's attending. Thank you. Very informative and interesting presentation. Amazing work you've done. Okay. Now, excellent presentation, Brigadier B.F. Subramaniam. Now, then this one now, Sachin, squadron leader, is a serving officer. Wonderful presentation. Would love to listen to you about the contribution of Indian sepoys during Second World War and the period after Japanese surrender. He's talking about the upcoming book. Okay. Now, maybe an e-comic book, somebody else also commented. Animation approach would be right for younger generation. And now, true. Gamification is a pretty popular across domains. It probably means specialism. Pardon me, I have to leave with somebody else. That's it. So we have, I guess, are there any more questions? Otherwise, I
would like to make two remarks, if you don't mind.
Please.
Two remarks. Throughout in my slideshow, you may have seen a drawing sequence of a man firing a gun. Do you remember that scene? I actually drew that myself.
Yes.
So that's number one. I mean, a little bragging rights there. Number two, coming back to Monte Cassino, you mentioned about that battle. I remember as a child, there was this famous TV series called The World at War. I think you may know this, Mr. Ramachandran. The World at War is narrated by Laurence Olivier.
Yes.
It's an award-winning series.
I've seen that. Yeah.
Yeah. And I remember one episode was about the Battle of Monte Cassino. And they were showing this line of Sherman tanks and Lee Grant tanks rushing to confront the Japanese and the Germans up there. And for a few seconds, I mean, I would say less than a second, it's just a fleeting second, there was an Indian military policeman directing the traffic. And I was 10 years old, and I remember seeing that. And I couldn't believe what I saw. And I asked my father, what is an Indian soldier doing? What's he doing in Italy? My father said, oh, they were there. They were everywhere at one point. These are Indian sepoys. That's it. You know? So when you mentioned Monte Cassino, it brought back that memory of that flashing, that fleeting moment.
You said it right. I mean, they were everywhere. The Indian soldiers. I mean, there is no entity. In fact, when I started taking out, this coffee table book with only 500 word text telling about every battle, I got tired ultimately. When are these guys going to stop fighting? I mean, they're everywhere. We don't know the campaigns they talk, like East Africa in First World War. They were fighting in East Africa until I went into that. I didn't realize, every corner of the world. You're 100% right.
Sure.
All right. Thank you very much for bringing up, this topic.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Beautiful presentation.
Let's not forget you invited me, so I got to thank you, and everyone else has to thank you too. Yeah.
All right,
First person accord itself is a magnificent performance.
Pardon, sir?
I said since it is the first person, almost like a first person accord.
Yes,
what happened?
Excellent. I mean,
that's why you and I, if you recollect your battle action and my battle action was also similarly presented, and they evoked a lot of praise. And I think Mr. Naidu has done a marvelous job today. You took us to virtually to the scene.
Yeah,
you are there amidst them.
Thank you.
Excellent show, Naidu.
Thank you, sir. And I hope one day I'll come to India to meet you, Mr. Ramachandran.
Oh, most certainly. We must. Madras is not very far from Singapore. So we.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Naidu. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. If you'll just hold on, I'll, traditionally we close our meetings with national anthem. Kindly hold on, I'll just play it. That's it.
Sepoy's homeland, India.
Beg your pardon?
Sepoy's homeland is India.
So I should have asked for Singapore national anthem also, since we are a Singaporean. So,
Thank you very much, everyone. Good night.
Good night, everybody.
Good night, everybody.
Thank you.
Good night.
I'm leaving now. Huh? I'll leave now.
Sure.
Okay.
Good night.
Good night, Edu.
Good night.
Good night, Nadu. Good night, Anand.
Good night. Good night.
everyone.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.
It must be quite late in Singapore and Malaysia by now. It's all early.
It's 11:15.
Good night, ladies and gentlemen. I'll now end the meeting.